Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking on a really difficult but absolutely necessary subject. We're going to examine the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, and gender-diverse people in Canada, the MMIWG2S crisis. And our mission here isn't to just list off tragedies. We want to unpack the systemic roots of this violence. We're using the big reports from the National Inquiry and advocacy groups to find the context that turns a statistic into an urgent human story for you.
And we have to start with the scale of the problem, just to frame this. It's chilling. Indigenous women are about 4.3% of the female population in Canada.
Okay.
But they account for 16% of all female homicide victims.
16%. That kind of overrepresentation, it's not an accident.
It's not random at all. It points to a repeated, fundamental failure of justice and safety.
And there's such a cultural weight to this. May 5th, Red Dress Day, is the National Day of Awareness. You see organizations like the Chiefs of Ontario First Nations Women's Council, the NIWRC, organizing a whole national week of action around it.
And you have to see the political context, too. After the National Inquiry, the government launched its federal pathway in 2021 to address all this. We see some specific investments, like $2.2 million in Nova Scotia to support families.
Which sounds good on paper.
It does, but the feedback from advocacy groups is that the pace of real structural change is just excruciatingly slow, and that slowness is part of the problem.
Okay, let's unpack that. The foundation for this whole conversation has to be the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. It started in 2016.
Right. And its final report from 2019, Reclaiming Power and Place, was monumental. It gathered stories from over 2,300 people, family members, survivors.
So what was the core finding? What did it all point to?
The report states the root cause is persistent and deliberate human and Indigenous rights violations and abuses.
Okay, deliberate.
Yes. And here's the crucial pivot. The inquiry went further than the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It described the crisis as a direct consequence of genocidal colonial structures. It said the word genocide is more appropriate than cultural genocide.
That's a profound distinction, moving from cultural genocide to just genocide. Why was that so important for the inquiry?
Because they found that the state's actions and its omissions met the definition under international law.
So it wasn't just about culture being lost.
No. It was about destroying a protected group, Indigenous women and girls, through systemic violence, through state inaction, and by creating conditions that lead directly to their death and disappearance.
That really raises a question about Canada's image on the world stage, doesn't it? It's often seen as a leader in human rights and gender equity.
And that contrast was pointed out directly by the UN. The Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, Dubravka Imonovic, noted Canada's leadership role. But then she immediately pointed to the grimmer domestic reality. Her words were that Indigenous women face institutional, systemic, multiple, and intersecting forms of discrimination.
Okay, let's dig into that phrase, systemic discrimination, because it's more than just one biased person, right? It's not just about individual prejudice.
Exactly. It means the problem is baked into the system. It's the standard practice, the laws, the police protocols, things that might even seem neutral on the surface. But in practice, they create a deeply dangerous adverse impact on Indigenous women, girls, and too as LGBTQIA people.
It's like injustice is written into the operating system.
That's a perfect way to put it.
So to really understand this, we have to go back. We have to look at the legislative framework that was, it seems, specifically designed to dismantle the power that Indigenous women traditionally held.
The contrast is just startling. I mean, historically, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit women held these vital roles in their communities. They were guardians of land, water, culture. They had legal, governmental, economic power.
Right, like Mohawk women,
right,
who had key governance roles.
Yes. Or Montagnais Naskapi women who made critical decisions about the community's movement, about survival.
This wasn't power that was just accidentally lost. It was targeted.
It was absolutely targeted. And the main tool for that was the Indian Act of 1876. It institutionalized gender-based discrimination. For starters, it barred women from holding elected positions.
But the really insidious part was about their legal status, right? The marrying out rule.
That was the killer. It made a woman's legal status, her very identity as an Indigenous person in the eyes of the state, conditional on her husband.
So walk us through that. What did an Indigenous woman actually lose if she married a non-Indigenous man?
She lost everything. She lost her Indian status automatically.
And that meant?
That meant she lost the right to live in her own community, on her reserve. She lost the right to take part in its governance. She lost access to specific health and education funding.
She was legally cut off from her own people.
Yes, the trauma from that, the loss of connection, it's intergenerational.
And it was layered, wasn't it? A man who lost his status would cause his wife and children to lose theirs, too.
Right. And for women, accessing any kind of property often required permission from an Indian agent.
An agent of the state.
Who had to confirm she was of good moral character.
Wow. Tying her rights to colonial patriarchal values.
Purely. And then there's the illegitimate female child rule. A First Nations man could register a son born out of wedlock for status.
But not a daughter.
But not a daughter. It's just pure gender discrimination written into law.
So you have this continuous legislative violence. You have forced sterilizations in some provinces.
Yes, and as the writer Lee Miracle said, it all created this powerful, dangerous societal message.
What was the message?
That Indigenous women do not deserve dignity,
Yeah.
that they don't deserve protection. The historical violence created the vulnerability we see today.
Okay, so let's bring this into the present. How does all of that historical context play out today, especially in the justice system and public services?
Well, you have to start with the policing crisis. The Highway of Tears in northern BC is probably the most infamous example. Families there estimate over 40 Indigenous women have been murdered or have disappeared. So many of those cases are unsolved.
And the inquiry found systemic failures in policing.
Deep failures. Police being slow to act, using policies like the 48-hour wait time to even report someone missing, and just pervasive contempt or indifference from officers.
That indifference comes through so clearly in the testimony. Like Melanie Morrison's story about her sister's case in Quebec, she described a disconnect.
Yes, a disconnect between the local police on the reserve and the off-reserve police.
And the implication for the family was devastating.
It was. It meant their sister's life, her case, was treated as less important, less urgent, because it started on the reserve. The family felt like they had to do all the work themselves.
And then you have cases where the system's timeline itself creates the injustice.
Like the case of Roseanne B., a Cree woman. Her body was found in 1991, 9 days after she went missing.
And her family got no answers.
Almost nothing. They only learned the real details in 2017 when the case was reopened.
But then it was closed again.
It was closed again, definitively, because of the statute of limitations. The system was too slow to offer closure, and then too fast to deny accountability.
And beyond just indifference, there was testimony about outright violence from officials.
Yes, witnesses like Alma M., Lise J., Deborah E., they all described sexual assault and harassment by police officers.
Which creates a situation where you can't even report the violence without putting yourself in more danger.
Exactly. And this extends into other services, like child welfare.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission had a powerful line about that.
It did. It concluded that the child welfare system has simply continued the assimilation that the residential school systems started.
And that leads to the testimonies about the missing babies, which are just almost impossible to comprehend.
We heard from Atakameku and Innu families about children going missing from hospitals in the 50s, 60s, 70s.
The parents were just told their child had died.
That's right. They were told the child died, maybe given a sealed casket, maybe just a photo. No death certificate, no burial site.
It's a complete denial of the right to grieve, to know the truth.
It is. A trauma that just continues.
And finally, the justice system's role in sentencing.
This is a complex one. It centers on the Gladue and Ifali principles.
Okay, can you just quickly explain what those are?
Sure. They're sentencing principles from the Supreme Court. They require judges to consider the unique systemic factors that might have brought an Indigenous person into conflict with the law. The goal is to reduce the massive overrepresentation in prisons.
So it's intended to be a restorative, context-sensitive approach.
That's the intention.
But what happens when those principles are applied to someone who has committed violence against an Indigenous woman?
That's where it breaks down. The inquiry found that sometimes this results in very short, lenient sentences for perpetrators, and it warned that this effectively risks normalizing violence against Indigenous women.
Right, I remember one specific case from the report. A court refused to issue an injunction to keep an assailant away from his victim's home and workplace.
Exactly, because it would have forced him to leave his community.
So the perpetrator's community ties were prioritized over the victim's actual safety.
Yes, and it meant she had to see her attacker at her job after he served a short sentence. It's profound institutional betrayal.
But, despite this incredibly painful context, this long history of violence and failure, The reports also highlight something else. They consistently point to the incredible strength and resilience of the women and families who testified.
It's truly the foundation for any path forward. You see survivors adopting these coping strategies that are rooted in their own values. Some women stayed in violent situations not from weakness, but to protect their children, to keep their family from being fractured again by the state.
And their path to healing wasn't through mainstream services.
No, they said healing comes from cultural pride, from ceremony, from collective support from their communities.
And you see this leadership resilience in individuals like Adrienne A., an Anishinaabe woman.
Her story is incredible. She was elected chief and immediately faced psychological abuse. They wouldn't even hold the welcoming ceremony for her.
And she had serious health issues.
3 heart attacks. But she found strength in traditional activities, in trapping and hunting, and just kept fighting to pull her community out of poverty. Her story embodies that persistence.
So after all this, the diagnosis is clear. A finding of systemic genocide, profound institutional indifference. What is the roadmap forward that Indigenous women themselves have laid out?
The demands are clear, and they're not negotiable. Canada has to implement the inquiry's calls for justice. It has to honor Indigenous self-determination, and it needs to address the root causes, not just the symptoms.
And those calls for justice, they're very specific, aren't they? They target the institutions we've been talking about.
Absolutely. A key one is to establish an independent, multi-jurisdictional civilian body.
A watchdog with real teeth.
Exactly. To investigate complaints against public services independent of the very institutions it's investigating. And, of course, a huge increase in long-term funding for Indigenous police forces. They need the staff, the training, the equipment to protect their own communities.
And that training piece is crucial. And it has to be for all public service workers, not just police.
Yes, because that's how you root out the systemic bias. The inquiry pointed out that police manuals sometimes misinterpret Indigenous body language.
Like looking downward.
Right. It can be misinterpreted as a sign of imminent assault when it's often a sign of respect. These cultural mistakes, when they're written into procedure, are dangerous. They have to go.
So this deep dive, it really confirms that this isn't a historical problem. It's an ongoing national crisis, and change has been painfully slow. The roadmaps, the solutions, they've been laid out for years by Indigenous women and their organizations.
And the ultimate call from all the families and survivors is really a duty for every single person to act, to end the violence, to restore safety and dignity for Indigenous women, girls, and SLGBTQIA+ people, and to build a better future on the truth they've shared.
The national inquiry found that the Canadian state failed in its obligation to exercise due diligence to prevent, investigate, and punish acts of violence against Indigenous women. So here's something to think about. How can any government that claims global leadership on human rights and one that claims a feminist mandate reconcile that position with its continued failure to fully address violence that its own inquiry has deemed to be systemic genocide?